All right, well, today I had the pleasure of sitting down with Ralph Montague, director at ArcDocs, a BIM consultancy in Ireland, and co-founder and director of the BIM Coordinator Summit. Welcome to the podcast, Ralph.
Thank you, Stephen. Looking forward to chatting to you about all
Yeah,
things
as am I.
BIM.
So that's right. So I wanted to start with this. What is the state of the BIM union? So if the implementation of BIM was a country, how would you kind of reflect on where we're at here at the end of 2024?
Probably a two-state country. There's some people that are very advanced and doing fantastic work, and then there's many people who still haven't tried to understand or even embrace BIM. So it's not a one-size-fits-all idea. I think it's a bit all over the shop.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of has its own little regionality to it, huh? And I think, from maybe the early conversation we had, you're in Ireland, you may be speaking a bit from a European context, but I think you do have a good global perspective. What are some of the drivers that you've seen in Europe that have helped kind of establish maybe BIM as more of a standard than maybe we are seeing in all sectors here in the US?
Yeah, I would say there's probably two key drivers. The one would be productivity. Europe has a challenge. I mean, it's probably a similar challenge to, say, the US, but like European labor is very expensive and we can't compete globally on labor rates. And so the answer to that is to improve productivity because or we have to take a significant cut in salary, which I don't think anybody wants to do. So productivity is definitely driving efficiencies and trying to improve the outcomes. And I suppose linked to that would be the whole sustainability, green climate change movement. As you probably know, the AEC sector is probably one of the worst culprits when it comes to CO2 emissions and energy use and raw material use, etc. And the European Union is seeing digitization as a way to improve sustainability in the sector. So those two things are probably driving the adoption. I think of course there are some mandates. I think in the UK there was a mandate implemented in 2010, which came into play in 2016 through the government. But again, that was a government's call to try and improve productivity in the sector. The government being one of the major buyers of construction. And there's been a few countries since that have mandated BIM. But I think behind that mandate is a driver for improved outcomes and productivity.
And when you maybe talk about the global perspective you have on where we're at as a community, a couple inputs that it seems like you might have into that is the BIM Coordinator Summit and BIM Heroes. And it seems like you've put some focus on kind of building communities that are global. How has that helped you kind of gain an understanding and also maybe diversify your understanding of the challenges?
Yeah, well, I suppose the driver behind creating international community is to disseminate good practice, best practice across regions. Because particularly like for us, if we're from Ireland and we're doing a job in the UK somewhere or in Europe, mainland Europe, it's very difficult if you have to do it in a different way each time. And so standardization of practice is really helpful for particularly for small companies, if you can be consistent in the way you deliver your services across multiple projects, across multiple regions. And, but of course, if everybody's doing things in their own way, it becomes difficult. So what we saw was that's exactly what was happening. Every region, every country was doing things in their own way, and we needed to get a more global conversation going about what is standardized practice, what is good practice, what is best practice, and so that was the driver behind creating an international community, but also to learn from each other because obviously each region is exploring and learning new things. That sharing of knowledge across the sector helps the whole sector. The rising tide lifts all boats kind of idea, and so. Yeah, that was the driver to create conversation across regions, but also across disciplines. I think one of the things we found over the last 15 years was the conversation of BIM was sort of restricted to architects and engineers and contractors, but clients, project managers, cost managers, sustainability managers, health and safety managers, all financiers, all these people that engage with the built environment and engage with information thought that BIM had nothing to do with them. And of course, it has everything to do with them. So we wanted to expand the conversation across the disciplines as well. So it was trying to get a cross-region, cross-discipline conversation going.
Yeah, it's a impressive feat to tackle. Has there been any inputs from regions that has surprised you? I think, maybe here in the US, we think very domestically about challenges. And then if we try and look global, maybe we think of what Europe is doing. But I mean, I'm sure, a lot of regions doing some interesting things. Have you been surprised about what you've seen from some of those inputs?
A bit about surprise, I suppose. As BIM consultants, we've spent most of our career trying to see what's happening worldwide anyway. So we've been learning, but I mean, there's definitely countries like Japan or Singapore or the North European countries in the Scandinavia which are very advanced in their use, but often you don't hear about it because it's not what they're doing is not communicated in the English language, and so you don't get to experience it. But there's definitely many parts of the world that are fairly advanced in their use of modern methods of construction and digital technologies that would be surprising, I suppose, to many people. Equally, the other way around, some of these countries are quite surprised about how backward so-called first world countries are in their adoption of these technologies, given that we're living in the 21st century and all that.
That's right. Yeah, and we'll dig into that a bit more. But maybe backing up a little bit, to look at your history, did you grow up kind of talking ISO standards, or what was your pathway to BIM?
Yeah, well, I'm an architect, so my background is in communicating architectural ideas. And when I studied and grew up, we were using drawing boards and pens and pencils and paper. So I've seen everything from that to CAD to BIM. But I still see it as the same idea. Like, we're trying to communicate information about buildings and infrastructure to people that have to carry out work. Digital technologies help in that communication, in that if I gave you a piece of paper, you'd have to go and make a photocopy of it and then make 10 copies and distribute it. Like, it's very slow to distribute analog information and quite cumbersome. And then even things like email and that are meant to speed it up can get quite messy because emails get lost and buried. So my journey has been this consistent idea of how do we produce and exchange information in better ways, and that's just led to digital technologies, as it has in every other sector. I mean, if you take banking, you wouldn't imagine going to your bank and somebody pulling out a typewriter and start typing on a piece of paper. Like, it's, every sector has digitized, some more than others. Construction's actually one of the slowest, believe it or not. I mean, like, worldwide studies have shown it's
Yeah.
at the bottom end of digitization.
But I also think, continuing maybe your analogy around banking and the digitization of other industries, those other industries on the backside of digitization is leveraging networks and aligned incentives and an understanding between upstream and downstream consumers in a way that I don't think yet we have in construction. Like, I think there's been a focus on digitization, and yet still we have kind of a disconnect between stakeholders. What a designer works on doesn't necessarily feed into maybe what your pre-con managers really need to actually go price the job, and vice versa. So why do you think that is, where we've made huge kind of strides in digitization, but we still have these large disconnects that maybe other industries don't necessarily have?
Yeah, it's fragmentation. I think other industries are far more connected in their supply chain, and if you let's say you're servicing a bank, you're probably going to be servicing that bank for the next 5, 10, 15 years, unless you do something terrible and go and find somebody else. But we have very short-lived contracts. If you might be servicing a project for 2 or 3 months, let's say you're an electrician, you may be on a project for 2 or 3 months doing some work, and then you're on to the next project, and then you're on to the next project. So there's a lot of disconnect in the supply chain with very short periods of engagement. And even architects and engineers, as an architect, you might be involved in a project for 2 or 3 years of its whole life cycle, but it's in comparative terms, that's still a slow. I mean, it's a short amount of time, and of course, every client you work with has different needs, and every team you work with has different processes and systems. It's hard work.
Well, and I think the fragmentation you speak to then also speaks to the power of being able to plan in a digitally flexible environment, right? And I think when we were talking before, you had a nice kind of manufacturing analogy. Can you kind of go into that of like, hey, imagine if, a car was coming down a production line and we started asking questions. Can you kind of do that
Yeah,
analogy again?
yeah. Well, so when they design something in manufacturing, whether it's a computer or car or whatever, I mean, they fully design it before they go to the production line. I think that's the first thing that they do differently. They don't go to the production line with a half-baked design and then start tweaking it on the production line. But that's exactly what we do in construction. We go to site with a half-baked idea and we start making chopping and changing and moving stuff and requesting changes as we're going along. So we're kind of making it up as we're going along, which is a very expensive and very disruptive and very dangerous way to produce anything. But that's what we do, and we're in the habit, I suppose, of doing that, of starting a job with what we'd call design intent information. Architects and engineers, and I say this as an architect, like I don't know how to build something because haven't built something. I know how to design something, but somebody still has to convert the design idea into something that's constructible. But we go to tender with design intent information and we expect a contractor to be on site and start digging holes the very day after he's signed the contract, without the time for the design intent information to be fully worked out into something that's constructible. And so we're working it out on the production line. If you imagine the site as a production line, we're actually figuring it out as it's going down the production line, and plumbers and electricians and carpenters are making decisions on the fly without understanding what's coming next. It's a bit of chaos. I think some people actually enjoy the chaos. It's the firefighting and the fun, but it's from a productivity point of view, it's not the best idea. The best time to make decisions is before you get to the production line, and that's what manufacturing has taught us. The whole idea of lean construction, which comes from lean manufacturing, is this idea of forward planning what you're going to do before you actually go and do it.
Yeah, I think it is interesting the point you make, which is we're an industry of problem solvers. We pride ourselves on being that. And yet and all the reward systems are based around the folks who can problem solve very well, quickly, etc. And yet if you compare that kind of profile of person to say maybe an industrial engineer who is thinking about the mechanics of the whole. Those are two very different mindsets in some ways. One is maybe, diving really granular into the problem. Another is trying to zoom out and identify root cause and do analysis. And obviously those exist also in our industry, but it does seem like from an incentive and from a reward system, again, maybe we've overworked a muscle on the problem solving side, and we haven't built the muscle around zooming out.
Yeah, well, I think the problem solving is still required, but I think what BIM offers is the opportunity to solve the problems earlier. The beautiful idea of BIM is you can build the thing in software and you can show it to people in its three-dimensional reality in software where you're not using real materials, you're not putting real lives at risk. And you can bring those problem solvers into that environment and you can say, right, find the problems and solve the problems here, which is the cheapest, quickest, safest place to do it. Rather than sending everybody out to site with real material, real people, real costs, real dangers, and saying solve the problems out there. So the problem, that's the idea of BIM, but people aren't really doing that. There's still people going to site without completed BIM, and many contractors producing BIM after the construction. So they go to site, they solve the problems in the normal way, which is the expensive, slow, disruptive, dangerous way, and then afterwards a team comes in and does an as-built BIM. So they've completely ignored the benefit that BIM was meant to bring to the whole process, which was to design the thing fully and work it out fully in software before you get to the real production. But it comes to your thing about incentives, because you really need to be employing those problem solvers earlier, and usually those problem solvers are with the contracting team. The traditional contracts go through a whole design procurement without those people involved. So we've got to change the procurement model where you're bringing those problem solvers to the table earlier. I think that's where things like IPD, integrated project delivery, and licensing contracting is trying to change the models, employing those people onto the team during the design stage so that they can actually do what they do best, which is solve the problems in this virtual space.
Yeah, and obviously you run into a challenge there, which is there's already a lack of, we'll call them problem solvers, we'll call them, the folks actually building the physical thing. And so then, kind of upending the current model that is already lacking in supply to require additional resources up front. To your point, does require some holistic thinking around contract structures and incentives
Yeah.
and maybe training.
Well, let's say that most of those skilled people at the moment are spending a significant portion of their time fixing problems that they shouldn't be fixing. Like in other words, redoing work that shouldn't have to be redone because it should have been solved beforehand. So, I don't know if they have to spend more time. They just have to spend different time. Spend some time interrogating the information before it becomes critical when it comes to production on site. Like, I mean, the dream for me would be that work on site is executed exactly like a production line. In other words, there's zero change. There's zero amendments. You just execute the work. The right materials at the right time, in the right hands, just gets installed exactly as it was intended, without all the usual disruption and delays. And I don't know if you've had any studies in the US, but in Europe we've had studies where productivities on site is something like 40%. So 60% of the time people are spending doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing, like reworking or waiting or just standing around wondering what to do because this drawing is wrong, or this piece of material isn't available, or this piece of equipment isn't available. So they're just standing around there 60% of the time when they could be doing something useful.
I mean, that's like it's like post language scramble, Tower of Babel type productivity numbers, I'm sure. But going back to your point about the the way we can leverage the digital, I think one challenge is they're lacking a clear owner. Like we know who the owner of the physical building is. And in theory, that should
Well,
go
not always.
through, right. But say in a traditional commercial build out, you've got an owner that you're working for. They've written out their program requirements. That's what we're building to. But there's no clear owner of the BIM environment as it relates to, the designer hands off their design models. They hand off a release form that essentially says, like, don't use this. It's not accurate. You use any part of this and you're liable. And so then that's the environment that people start coordinating within. And obviously you're already off to a bad start. So isn't one of the challenges here to solve is clearly identifying the owner of that digital environment through the life cycle
Yeah,
of the build?
yeah, that is the challenge. And I wasn't joking when sometimes you don't know who the owner of the real building is, because if you take a commercial real estate development, the developer wants to build the building and probably sell it off or rent it off, so they don't actually have a long-term interest in the functioning of the building. I mean, they might have a financial interest or whatever, but in other words, if it's going to be more expensive or more difficult for somebody else to operate the building in the future because of the lack of information, they don't care. Like, why? It's not their problem. It's not their business. So you don't always know who has the long-term interest, and this comes back to the idea of fragmentation. You can have fragmentation even in the owner's body, if you like. I mean, we've seen projects like a pharmaceutical project where the different divisions of the same company didn't really care what the next division wanted or was going to get. Like all they cared about was their own budget and what they were going to spend. If their capital delivery budget didn't allow for some additional time to secure the information so that the operations would work for the next 20 years, well, then it didn't matter, because even though they worked for the same company, they only focused on their own. So you have fragmentation even within one organization, never mind across all the multiple companies that participate in the project. And you could easily have 50 to 100 companies participating in one project at different times, each with their own business goals and only narrowly focused on what they need to deliver without considering the long-term effect across the whole life cycle. So that is the challenge. That is, you need somebody who will take a holistic view from beginning to end, and that's difficult to find.
And then I think if that doesn't exist, which I think in a number of, call them commercial verticals, you don't have that long-term thinking on the owner side. And some you do, right?
Yeah.
Maybe like mission critical space, you've got owners that are holistically thinking of buildings as their, critical assets. But where that
I
doesn't
think that's where
exist,
regulation and standardization comes into place, because
yeah.
certain regulations require information to pass from stage to stage. Not that everybody's complying with those regulations, but I think what regulation is trying to do is say, well, if you're only involved in design, you've got to make sure that whatever you pass over to construction is suitable for use to comply with regulation and legislation. So you have some legal requirement or professional duty, at least, to do a good job. And equally, as contractors hand information and the physical building over to the operators, there's some regulatory framework in which they have to provide certain information, safety information or maintenance information. So regulation is tries to do that, but I suppose it depends on how well the regulation is being policed, and that's probably where it falls down.
But I also think, I mean, I understand the role regulation can play and the role standardization can play coming from, maybe a municipality or a government. But like, I'm an Ayn Rand libertarian, and I have to think that if the right incentive structure exists, ultimately, let's take it from the GC standpoint. There's a portion of that project delivery where they own that facility, that physical space. And so if I'm going to own that physical space and the production and the safety metrics associated with delivering that physical space, I'm going to want to create a digital space where I can essentially simulate my planning so that that physical space is going to hit the different desired outcomes that I have. And so I think it does then come down to philosophy around how best to achieve these outcomes, regardless of the owner perspective, regardless of the regulatory environment. And I think that's where we're still on the cusp of, right? We've got a few different, at least here in the GC in the US, we've got a few in the GC market that are starting to understand that. So like regardless of what the design model says, regardless of maybe the regulatory environment, I'm going to take ownership of this digital space because it represents a
Mm.
simulatory environment where I can plan and do the physical better. But maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm
No,
thinking
no,
too blue sky
definitely.
about the problem.
No, no, and that's what I said at the beginning. We have these kind of two states, because there's certainly companies that have recognized the huge productivity benefits that, as you described, this simulation can bring to their business, never mind what anybody else is doing. And those types of companies are streaks ahead, and they're really leveraging these digital technologies to get the best business outcomes for themselves. And then, of course, their clients, whoever they're working for, are the beneficiaries as well, because they get better quality product, better information at the end, better delivery, better control of budgets, time, etc. That translates into better reputation for the if it's a contractor or a designer, and more work. And so some have recognized that completely, but others are really operating at the lower end of the scale and just trying to do as little as possible. Even when it comes to regulations and things, they'll really just try and hit the minimum targets and not really care about anybody else, or just trying to do as little as possible. And that's, I mean, I think that's where regulation really needs to step in. One of the examples I often use is there was a fire disaster in the UK called the Grenfell Tower. It was a a tower block that caught on fire and 70 people lost their lives. It was a terrible disaster, and I mean, there were many reasons for it, but one of the things was that it took the fire brigade or the emergency services 24 hours to find the gas stop-off valve. Like, nobody knew where it was. There was no information. Nobody recorded anywhere where this valve was, and so you had natural gas pumping into a fire. It was just terrible. Well, there were many problems around it, but that tragedy has actually sparked a whole new update of the regulations in the UK around safety and who's responsible for making sure that buildings are safe at the end. So I think in a fragmented industry where it's very difficult to pinpoint who's responsible, regulation actually has to be the umbrella, I think. Otherwise, you have diversity what's it? It's diffusion of responsibility. Nobody takes responsibility. There's a fantastic example it's a story in the 1960s, I think, in New York, where a woman was murdered in New York outside of her apartment, and 38 people witnessed the murder, but nobody called the police because everybody thought somebody else would do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the bystander effect. And that's what happens in a fragmented sector. Everybody thinks, well, it's not my job, it's somebody else's job.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Just the psychology of the mob. So when you think about 2025 and beyond, there's a role that I think technology can play in maybe, lowering the barrier to entry for maybe smaller regional firms or for helping, project teams more quickly adopt certain workflows. I think the challenge has been that a lot of those maybe solutions have kind of oriented themselves to, I would say, a portion of the category that can more easily be monetized. So presenting solutions that can raise money rather than maybe really solve problems. But I'm leading the witness a bit. As you look at the future of technology, like what are some of how do you see it influencing BIM adoption and kind of where we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I always say that technology is a tool. So technology by itself is not a solution to anything. Like, you have a process, and the technology has to make the process more efficient or better, or and as a tool. But part of the problem with technology is you have software developers and people developing technologies without understanding the process. So they're developing tools that don't actually have a real purpose or not making a significant impact on the process. So that's why I sort of come back to standards, because to me, standards are an agreement between people of an expected outcome of a process. That's exactly what a standard is. It's a consensus agreement of what is best practice, or what is good practice, or even what is emerging practice. And once you can agree that and you understand the process, then we can look at tools and say, well, how can we make this process easier or more efficient, or have better outcomes? When you have tools that meet the standards, then you have a winning solution. But tools without meeting the standards are just shiny gimmicks, I think. And we have a lot of those. I suppose there's a lot of tools that have been created that don't really actually add much efficiency to the
So
process.
let's start naming names. This will be the most popular part of the. I'm just kidding, but yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think that is true.
yeah. And then coupled with that is people's attitude towards technology. So a lot of people see technology as something expensive and compared to human labor. So they'll make a person who they're paying 50,000 a year salary to use an outdated tool because they don't want to buy the tool, which is probably only costs €1,000 or $1,000, which is it's the wrong idea. I mean, it's like giving a carpenter a screwdriver. I mean, he can probably turn 10 screws in an hour with a manual screwdriver. But if you gave him a power drill, like it'd do 10 in a minute. The technology is meant to make that human being more productive, more efficient, and less stressed. If it's good technology, and then in that instance, technology is actually cheap. If you give a carpenter a power drill, like the cost of the power drill compared to the cost of the carpenter is almost negligible, particularly when you take into account the productivity gains. And so good tools in the hands of good people are really, really cheap, and you get significant productivity gains. And a lot of the industry are not equipping their people with the right tools. They throw humans at the problem. If productivity slows down, they go and hire another 6 people instead of sending the people they have on some training or giving them some good power tools. So
I mean, I think you're right.
there's an attitude to technology that needs to change as well.
And I think another angle on that is if you use the analogy of the power drill versus the screwdriver, that is a good tool because it is understanding the workflow of that carpenter, staying within the workflow, and it's optimizing is well integrating itself into that workflow. And I think so many of our tools don't have a good understanding of the workflow that they're playing in. And so then they're kind of clunkily dropped into a workflow that doesn't well integrate with adjacent technologies. And then it's creating incremental value, but not necessarily holistic value. And so then that's where people talk about like the tech pile and just the fee structures of all of these SaaS solutions that are stacking on top of each other. So I do think, I spent some time in maybe construction technology, and I think there's some there's some changes that need to happen in the go-to-market approach of those companies. And, this is probably another podcast, but I do think one of those challenges is I think the venture capital funds coming into that market is fundamentally maybe perverting a little bit the intent of those tools and how well they need to play within the little silo that they're addressing and the total addressable market kind of muddying the waters of how they solve problems, but I'm getting off on a tangent. When you think of I read an article, I forget the author, but it was titled Situational Awareness, and he kind of had a 10-part series of where we're at, where we're going. And essentially one of his kind of hypothesis was by 2027 we could have, artificial general intelligence, and potentially an output of that could be the automation of AI research in itself, which would then kind of create this exponential learning curve and potentially we go into super intelligence by the end of the decade. All of those, a lot of speculation. But when you think of how AI could influence BIM workflows, is there something in the next like 2 to 3 years that you see as tangible as something that could happen?
Yeah, so I think when I think of AI, I think of the sort of garbage in, garbage out analogy. So AI is an incredibly powerful tool, but you have to feed it the right information. Because if you feed it the wrong information, you're still going to get the wrong answer. You'll get the wrong answer quicker, which is, so you can be more efficient at being wrong. But that's not effective, so what you really want to do is be right, and you want to be more efficient at being right. So AI by itself, without some control of the quality on the data that goes into the AI, is potentially dangerous because people will casually trust the AI, assuming that it's giving them the right answer, when in fact it might be giving them the wrong answer because it's been fed the wrong information as an input. So I think that's the danger, is that you make an assumption that the AI is giving you the right answer and you're not understanding what's happening in the background. So I think coupled with AI has to be some mechanism for controlling the quality of information. And that's why I think as humans we're still not going to disappear, because when it comes to people taking professional responsibility and liability on information, that'll still be a human. Like, no AI company is going to say, well, if you use our AI, we'll stand up in court and defend the answer. They're going to have some disclaimer that says, if you use our tool, good luck with that. So ultimately it's still going to come down to some responsible professional having to take liability for the outcome, and those professionals will definitely want to know what's happening under the hood of the AI and what information is going in and what information is coming out. And so I don't think AI by itself, it's like giving a power drill to somebody who doesn't know carpentry. Like, you have to understand what you want to do with the tool and then use it appropriately. It's going to be an interesting space. I think AI is already, in the last 2 years, had a tremendous effect on people's general productivity. But I think we'll see more to come. But I think we'll also see some problems, and we'll need to find some solutions. I think what's going to be really interesting in years to come is AI coupled with distributed ledger technology or blockchain. What's interesting about distributed ledger technology is it's keeping a record of every transaction of information, because at the moment we don't have a really good record system. Like some information is emailed to you, some's given to you on a USB stick, all sorts of chaos when it comes to the exchange of information. And you might be looking at a file and you have no idea at the moment whether that's the latest file, whether that's the file that the architect has signed off and is willing to take responsibility for. So you're making all sorts of assumptions on the information, and then you're going to dump all that sort of uncontrolled information into an AI and sort of trust the results. But I think once we start exchanging information through some technology that records the transaction and the status of information. In other words, who provided the information, when they provided it, what purpose was it provided for, has it been approved, has it been accepted, all those kind of transactional records about information stored in a ledger that then the AI can process and say, well, I found some information, I know who provided it, when they provided, what the purpose was, what the status is in terms of approvals, acceptances, etc., and then process the information. That will give you a much better result. And at least if there was a problem, you could go back to the ledger and say, which piece of information did you promise? What was the historical record of it? So I think the coupling of AI and distributed ledger or blockchain will be a very exciting space going forward.
I mean, that is interesting because I think to your point, blockchain has the opportunity to be kind of the ultimate common data environment.
Well, it'll keep records. Like blockchain, I mean, it stores little bits of information. So it's not going to store a 600 megabyte Revit file on the blockchain. Like each block of code is just a small bit of code. But what will be stored is the relevant information, like the file in the hash. A hash on a file is like a fingerprint of a file. Who provided, when provided. So some key transactional information will be stored on the blockchain. The file itself will probably be stored in some server. It could be a interplanetary public server or IPF server, but it won't. I don't think it will be on the blockchain because that's too much data.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
But the combination, I think the common data environment, and this is a good topic actually, because a lot of people, when they talk about common data environments, they imagine a system like Autodesk Construction Cloud or Procore, or and they say that's the common data environment, as if one system was all the information. But firstly, that's not the way the ISO 19650 standard describes the common data environment. It's much broader. The common data could be across multiple systems, and it's still common data to the project. I think that's the intention. So definitely, I do see in the future people will see interconnected systems that form the common data environment. And people will use different systems for different purposes. So designers might use Autodesk, contractors might use Procore, building operators might use IBM Maximo. People will use the tool that's most appropriate to them. Like a carpenter, you wouldn't give the
Yeah.
carpenter the wrong tool.
Well, and I mean, for maybe the entrepreneurs potentially listening, like, I think there's a business opportunity there, which is, not necessarily building one single platform that someone could say is the common data environment, but starting to link all these disparate silos of information into a cohesive understanding of dynamic data. And it does seem like we're much too late to still be having these problems of duplicate file structures
Yeah,
everywhere.
there's people working on that already. Yeah, I think that if you look outside of our sector, I mean, even the way we're communicating now across the internet, we're not exchanging files. Like I didn't make a video and send you the video and then you playing the video. We're doing this through internet protocols, and it's much more fluid. The exchange of information is much more fluid than, say, what we used to in our sector. But that's where it'll move. People will. I actually think ultimately people will retain their own data and only be sharing transactional information. And when you need access to a piece of information, like you access a web page now, people don't send you their whole website. You just go to the web page when you need it.
Well, and like torrents are probably a decent reference, right? Of
Mm.
like you're not sharing a full file. You've got a whole network of peers that are all sharing kind of a portion of the file, and that allows for a quicker download and upload. I'm well beyond my skis in terms of understanding that protocol, but yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, and that
So
so IP
go ahead.
interplanetary file systems work like that. So they distributed networks of files that don't reside in one place. You can access, if one server's down, you can access that file. It's been replicated elsewhere. If a node goes down, so you're far less dependent on one server being available all the time. But yeah,
So Ralph,
it'll be an interesting space to watch, I think, in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we go, I did want to ask you about BIM Heroes because I think, it's as we look at where the community is and how we move forward, I think you make a great point, which is let's at least make sure we're bringing people together, having kind of collective conversation and understanding and learning from these different regions of excellence. So was that the kind of
Yeah.
origin kind of thesis for BIM Heroes and maybe where is it now?
Yeah, so BIM Heroes is I would say three things. It's a community of practice. So it's people from around the world who are practicing digital construction rather than theory. Just they're not just academics. People are actually doing it, and they're sharing experiences with each other. So this worked, that didn't work. I tried that. How do you do this? The second thing is we're creating a body of knowledge. So as people are discussing and writing articles or commenting on other people's articles or exchanging discussions. That body of knowledge is building, and it means that other people who want to learn can come there and have access to that body of knowledge and shorten their own learning curve without having to go through the experiences themselves. And then the third thing is it's a network marketplace. So it's people in the AEC space from around the world who have services or products or technologies, and they want to connect with other people who want those things. As we know, as we said at the beginning, we are a very fragmented industry. I think that something like 95% of companies are micro organizations, like less than 10 people. They don't have dedicated marketing teams and whatever. And so by bringing the community together and creating a marketplace, people can exchange their ideas, their services, or form collaboration. So people with different disciplines can come together on innovation projects. So there's all sorts of amazing things that can happen when you bring people from different cultures, different disciplines, with different levels of experience together in both teaching and learning. So it's kind of a melting pot, I suppose, if you like, of innovation. And then in the spirit of practice, we're exploring these worlds of distributed ledger technology and smart contracts as well. So because we see this as a future for our industry, where we have more efficient administration of contracts through technologies. And so to try it out in practice, we're actually creating this community as a community owned by the community on a distributed ledger using smart contracts, where every contribution that members make to the community is rewarded through a digital token that will have reputational value, voting rights, and financial value in the future. So, it's a small experiment to test these things. So it's a fascinating project as a whole. It's really exciting to meet people from around the world, from different regions, from different cultures, and to see what they're doing and learn from everybody. You learn every day. It's fascinating.
Yeah. What a cool community and experiment. So appreciate you walking
Yeah.
us through that. But I really enjoyed this chat with you, Ralph. Thanks for taking some time.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.